Utilitarianism. As always, we have our outline. So introduction, why are we discussing them? History, what is their history? Historical background, what influenced them? Philosophy, what did they believe? Philosophical background, what influenced their beliefs? Utilitarianism, which confusingly enough is the name of a book, or rather a series of essays about utilitarianism that first made it really popular. We're going to use that as our example for how the utilitarians argued. All right, cool. So, introduction. Why are we talking about them? Well, in the 19th century, ethics, so how to live, becomes not only a problem of a life well lived, but a problem of governance. So it takes on this different form. It's not just about an individual person anymore, it's about government. And why is that? Well, governing has become way more complex. So first of all, there are more people than ever before, and more people under individual governments than ever before. There's also this new troubling belief that people have inherent rights. And so the most famous proponent of that, or the most famous person who believes in that, is John Locke. And we'll talk about him in a couple weeks. So because everything's so much more complex now, we can no longer rely on intuitions or virtues or anything that previous thinkers had thought about. So instead, we need something better. We need something scientific. This is, after all, an age of science. So applying science to ethics seems logical. So what is our scientific answer for ethics? Well, it's utilitarianism. We're going to try to measure the morality of an act by the impact on people's happiness. And this attempt to measure and quantify morality is what makes it scientific and what makes it important to talk about. So, why are we talking about utilitarianism? It's an influential attempt to make ethics scientific. So, let's talk a bit about the history of utilitarianism. So, utilitarianism as a general concept has a really long history. So the basic idea of measuring the goodness of an act by the impact on happiness, it's not original to any thinker. So goodness and happiness is argued by the Greeks. The Stoics have their connection. Aristotle has his connection. Then the Christians come after, and the Christians have their arguments. And then utilitarianism in a scientific sense is made by David Hume's mentor, Francis Hutcheson. But we're not going to start with him, because we need to start with modern utilitarianism, which is really this first time that utilitarianism becomes prominent and important. And we'll see why. But the basic answer is, this is when it's time for utilitarianism. The first modern utilitarian is Jeremy Bentham, who is this distinguished-looking gentleman here. He's a wealthy, middle-class Englishman born in 1748. So this is about 28 years before the American Revolution, which as an American tends to be how I define things or think about things. So Bentham is born during a pretty rough time in English history. It has an incredibly complex and punitive penal code. So this was around the time that the concept of sending people as slaves to Australia was first brought about. So Bentham's convinced that English law is hopelessly complex and secretly benefited a sinister interest, which is the aristocracy. He's middle class, and his natural enemy is going to be the upper class. So he wants to create a system of laws which would be fair, easy to understand for everyone, and based on a single overriding principle. Now, what exactly would that principle be? Well, of course, it'd be utilitarianism. This idea of laws are good based on how they impact people's happiness. So Bentham is not just an armchair philosopher. He's not just sitting up in an ivory tower. He's a very practical man. So he's active in both philosophical affairs and in practical reform. So he creates London's first preventative police force and co-founds a very influential philosophical journal. So preventative police force is one to prevent crimes before they happen rather than responding to them after it. And I know that seems like a really obvious thing now. Like, you know, why would you have a police force that wouldn't try to prevent crimes? But it wasn't obvious then. And this was the first one in London and one of the first ones in the world. So Jeremy Bentham also had a lot of pet projects, and his most famous one was trying to convince Britain to adopt his idea of the perfect prison, which is here. It's called the panopticon. So the panopticon is circular. In the center of this prison is a single watchman. So due to the design of the prison, the watchman can see into any individual person's cell, but the prisoners would not be able to see if the watchman was watching them. So the prisoners would always have to act as if the watchman was watching them, even if he wasn't. So that would mean they'd fix their behavior, and Bentham says that means they'd be able to become honest. Or in his words, it would be a mill for grinding rogues honest. So, by the way, this idea has a lot of influence on later writers, especially Foucault, who writes a ton about this. So, you guys might think this is horrible, but just some food for thought. If you think about a modern prison or a modern city, you're always being watched by security cameras, right? You never know if someone's actually on the other side of that security camera. You don't know if anyone's really watching you. So in some sense, we're all living today in All right, I'm back. So yeah, I thought that would, okay. So, thank you. I'm even on an Ethernet connection. I really can't explain why my internet is dropping out. All right. So, we're all being watched. So this is interesting, influential idea. So, and a couple of them are actually built. So for instance, this one is the Illinois State Penitentiary. It's no longer in use, and this is obviously an artist drawing, but there was a couple of these prisons actually built. All right. So Bentham's intellectual descendants influenced British politics immensely, including John Bowring. Unfortunately, my Chinese isn't good enough to read these characters, but I assume yours is. And John Bowring is the 4th governor of Hong Kong, one of the causes of the Second Opium War with China. So in terms of Chinese history, John Bowring is not a particularly beloved figure, but he is important. His most influential philosophical descendant is John Stuart Mill, son of James Mill, one of Bentham's closest friends. And John Stuart Mill writes the series of essays Utilitarianism, which is what we're going to be reading from today. So, let's talk about John Stuart Mill. So, John Stuart Mill, born in 1806, has one of the strangest and saddest upbringings of any child I have ever heard of. So his father was determined to raise a genius to help spread the cause of utilitarianism. And as a result, forbid his son from having any friends his own age and raised his son within a rigorous education. So in terms of this rigorous education, by age 8, Mill was reading ancient Greek and Latin. By age 12, he was reading Aristotle in the original Greek. By 13, he was helping his father write an economics textbook. And somewhat unsurprisingly, by age 20, he was practically suicidal. And he had a very difficult time until he recovered and learned to lead a normal life. But this is one of the few attempts I'm familiar with in which someone has very deliberately tried to raise their child to be a genius. And in the case of John Stuart Mill, it went very poorly. Yes, under a tremendous amount of pressure. And so this is John Stuart Mill here. So Mill's professional career was as an administrator for the British East India Company, which is quite important, and we'll talk about a little bit in a sec. And during this time, as an administrator, he wrote several influential works, including Defense of Liberalism and multiple defenses of Britain's harsh rule over India. So yeah, he was justifying why Britain gets to rule over India. Interestingly enough, he only wrote his Defense of Utilitarianism in 1861, 25 years after his father died. So his father ended up succeeding. He did raise a son who made utilitarianism famous, but John Stuart Mill waited 25 years after his father died to do so. And also on a side note, in relation to this course, John Stuart Mill was Bertrand Russell's godfather. So connections, Bertrand Russell's godfather, pretty neat. So utilitarianism has continued as an influential philosophy, both the academy and in the courts, to the present day. Even Karl Popper tried his hand at a new version of it, but what he did was not influential, and I don't think it was particularly clever, so we're not going to discuss it. And to illustrate utilitarianism, I have a comic from Calvin and Hobbes, one of my favorite comics. Mo says, I want that truck, Twinkie. Calvin says, it's mine, Mo. I brought it from home. Said, give me the truck. Mo, you can't just take things from people because you're bigger. And Mo says, I'm not taking it. You're giving it to me because we'll both be so much happier that way. Calvin says, how touching. So Mo here is a utilitarian. He knows that if Calvin gives him the truck, both he and Calvin will be much happier. All right. So history, utilitarianism was started by Bentham in the 1700s, but became influential under Mill in the 1800s. So let's talk about utilitarianism. So the historical background, rather, what influenced it. So utilitarianism is a philosophy that it's time for. And why is that? Because Britain has grown over the past 100 years from a rocky outcrop off of Europe to the most powerful country on earth. As the saying went, the sun never sets on the British Empire, because look at how much, this is 1897, the British Empire. Look at how much Britain controls. It's incredible. It's a huge amount of land. And so the reason why the sun never sets is because the sun is always shining somewhere along here. It's pretty amazing. So let's take a look at why governing Britain was so complex in the 19th centuries. We'll look at England, then at the major colonies, and then at Britain's place in the world. So, England in the 19th century is dominated by the Victorian era, which lasts from 1837 to 1901. It's named that because the ruling monarch was Queen Victoria, this distinguished-looking woman here. So the era is now famous for its ideas of proper behavior in its literature, like Charles Dickens. We're concerned with what's happening politically and economically. And by the way, if you watch a movie and you see guys dressed like this, with the top hats and the suits, that's the Victorian era. So if you guys watch the Sherlock Holmes with Robert Downey Jr., that was the Victorian era. So from 1851 to 1901, the population of England doubled from 16.8 million to 30.5 million. Scotland's population rose from 2.4 million to 4.4 million. So, and Scotland at this point is part of the United Kingdom. So both of these are growing really quickly. Ireland's population has 8.2 million to 4.5 million due to deaths from famine caused by Britain in part and emigration. So, by the way, the famines of the 19th century are how my ancestors ended up in America. Ireland's famine, because my ancestors did not have any food. So, new advances in technology caused the economy to grow rapidly, resulting in both growing pains, the rise of labor and unions, and an increase in the standard of living. So this is good parts. Businessmen and industrialists became more and more powerful throughout this era, chipping away at the prominence of the aristocracy and causing many to question why the government and church were still controlled by the gentry. Remember, this is something that Bentham had a problem with. He thought that the government was controlled by the aristocracy, and he has trouble with this. He's wealthy, he's educated. Why doesn't he get the same say in government that the aristocracy do? But as things advance, as technology advances, as the economy advances, England experiences some big problems. Slums, crime, child labor, and the great social evil of prostitution. So slums, huge number of people, small dirty spaces. Crime, and here we have the stocks, which is, you can probably tell how this worked. head gets locked in there, hands get locked in there, and you get stuck in there for a couple days. And people can throw stuff at you. And then this is an actual picture of a Victorian prostitute. And this is it's actually a pretty nice picture, not particularly racy by our standards. So one interesting reason for prostitution is that by 1851, there were 750,000 more women than men in England. So because in England, sex outside of marriage and prostitution were assumed to be the same thing. If you would have sex outside of marriage, you would also be willing to be a prostitute. Even the English saw, even the most proper Englishmen saw that if 750,000 women couldn't get married, prostitution was probably going to become pretty popular. So that's an interesting social cause of prostitution. Also interesting that sort of the reverse problem of China right now. And the timing of my dropout does seem rather suspicious. I'll admit that. All right. No more mentions of China. Only of England. Jolly old England. All right. So, colonies of Britain. So Napoleon gets defeated in the beginning of the 19th century, and Britain is without any serious international rival. As a result, it expands a lot. So from 1815 to 1914, Britain adds 26 million square kilometers and 400 million people to its empire. Now remember, England has 30 million people. They've just added in 100 years 400 million people. That's incredible. That's a huge gain. It's unquestionably the preeminent naval power, and it's also the determiner of the economy for any country that relies on overseas trade. So for instance, in terms of influences on others' economy, England controls Hong Kong and also helps control the economy of China because of their dominance of the ocean. So all of this is helped by steamships, telegraphs, and to a lesser extent railroad, which bind the country together. So steamships, telegraphs, sort of hard to explain if you've never seen them in action. If you haven't, I would suggest you look them up because they're pretty neat. All right. In the middle of the 19th century, Britain transferred control from India from the British East India Company, which was a private company, to England. And India became the crown jewel of the British Empire. By the way, this is a really interesting history if you don't know of it. It's very strange. This is just a company, like Microsoft or Apple or whatever. So it's very strange that they had control of a country in the first place. Also, funnily enough, they never even wanted to have control of India. They just wanted to trade with India. But because they aggressively defended and expanded their trading privileges with India, they accidentally take over India in the 18th century. It's a weird story. It's really an accidental conquest of a country. So Britain also took over South Africa during this time under the push of Cecil Rhodes, who was an industrialist who wanted South Africa's mines. So the British taking over South Africa leads to a lot of conflict with the Dutch who are there, and this leads to several wars called the Boer Wars, the consequences of which are still being felt today. Also, Cecil Rhodes, if you guys have ever heard of the Rhodes Scholarship, which is a pretty famous scholarship you can get when you graduate from university, this is the guy who funded it originally. While most of Britain's white colonies were allowed more self-rule during the 19th century, so Canada, Australia, and New Zealand all become much more independent, Ireland gets cracked down upon. And the worst example of this, sort of like the most infamous historical example, is during the potato famine of 1845 to 1852. So fungus affected potatoes. The Irish didn't have any potatoes, which was their main crop. So Britain exported food from Ireland. So that's pretty awful. When there was a famine in Ireland and people were starving from a lack of food, Britain exported their food. And Ireland has never forgiven Britain for this. And the conflicts in the 20th century between Ireland and Britain, this was one of the main reasons for it. So, everyone clear so far? All right, awesome. So now let's talk about Britain's place in the world. So this is a picture of a featuring lyrics from a song that became quite popular during this time, Rule Britannia. I won't sing it for you guys. I actually had a history teacher in high school who used to sing for us. But he had a much better voice than I did. So the 19th century was a time of dominance for Great Britain. France, England's greatest enemy, had lost much of its power after Napoleon was defeated in the early 19th century. And Spain, which had been a great power in the previous centuries, had pretty much fallen off the map. Prussia had started to establish itself as a great power, but it wasn't there. The Ottoman Empire and the Qing dynasty were in decline. They weren't as powerful as they had been. The United States of America was reasonably powerful, but they only really cared about North and South America. They didn't care about the rest of the world. Who was the only one left? Russia. So the only real competitor to British power was Russia. Russia really wanted to expand its territory. They wanted a warm water port, so a port where you can launch ships out of, and warm water because you can use it year-round. It never gets clogged up with ice. The most obvious way of getting it was through India. This is still an issue for the Russians, by the way, warm water ports, and a large reason for some of their strategic alliances around the world, for instance with Syria, is access to warm water ports. So the British were afraid of the Russians coming to India. The Russians were afraid that the British would come up through Central Asia, so northeast of India. Here are some Russians in the 19th century. This starts a sort of early Cold War between the British and the Russians, with all sorts of spy games and fun stuff, which ends at the end of the 19th century, Russia occupying much of Central Asia, and Afghanistan as a buffer state between Russia and India. And so these spy games between Russia and England pass into popular legend, become famous stories, with Rudyard Kipling's fictionalized account of what he called the Great Game. This was sort of like James Bond, before James Bond. They're quite exciting stories, not particularly historically accurate, but if you're looking for an entertaining story, that's that. All right, so let's summarize. In short, Britain is more complicated than it's ever been. The number of people and entities involved in the governance of Britain and its empire means that if it's going to survive, there needs to be an unprecedented level of organization and coordination within the government. The government has to become more complex and better at dealing with complex situations than it's ever been. So this is why it's time for utilitarianism. It's a scientific way of determining what the right action is at any given moment. There's no doubts, there's no arguments, it just tells you what you should do. That's why I say it's a moral code fit for an empire. All right. So, historical background, Britain is the preeminent world power in the 1800s. So, are there any questions on history, historical background, Britain's colonies? Yo, team, huh? All right. No. All right. Awesome. Let's keep going. So let's talk about the philosophy now. So before we begin, I'm just to be a bit clear, we're only going to cover utilitarianism in the 19th century. So this is what's called classical utilitarianism. So if Kant's philosophy has impacted Britain, the short answer is no. And we'll talk about why that is, because it really seems like it should be. It really seems like this is, you can see the connections with utilitarianism. It seems to make sense, but Kant's philosophy did not impact Britain, and we'll talk about that a bit later. So, we're going to cover the utilitarianism in the 19th century. So classical utilitarianism, that's for Bentham and Mill. This is both because I need to keep it somewhat brief, and also because I need to leave something for the two classes from now where we'll talk about a twist on utilitarianism. So, this is, by the way, a picture of young Bentham looking a little strange. So Bentham starts like Kant did with a foundation. But Bentham's foundation is psychological, not philosophical. So Kant started with his distinctions between, analytic and synthetic, a priori, a posteriori. Bentham says, no, I'm doing psychological. So Bentham's psychological foundation is that every human being seeks pleasure and avoids pain. And this controls everything that we do. We're always seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. In Bentham's term, we are self-interested. So we need a legislator to intervene between self-interested individuals and make a society. So this is difficult. Everyone's just going to be pursuing their own interests. So the legislator needs to do something about that, the lawmaker. So the basis of a legislator's decisions must be on knowing that people are always going to be self-interested, and he needs to always moderate between these self-interested individuals. In order to make everyone happy, he needs to maximize pleasure and minimize pain for everyone affected by his rulings. So there is a problem with this straight from the get-go, which you might be able to see. So if every human being is self-interested, only seeks pleasure and avoids pain, then a reasonable question is, who are the legislators going to be? Because any legislator is just going to be as self-interested as anyone else, and so he'll only enact laws that benefit him. So Bentham has a lot of trouble with this for a long time, about who the legislators will be if everyone is self-interested, and then eventually just comes to the conclusion, well, people aren't only self-interested, sometimes they're interested in other people, but when we make laws, we have to pretend like they're always self-interested. They're always seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, even if that's not necessarily true. All right, so that's the foundation. So let's talk about how we moderate between self-interest. Self-interest is a bit like Hobbes' natural state. You can definitely compare them. When a person is seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, they're imagining consequences. So when you think, I want this, it's because you think it'll give you pleasure. When you're avoiding pain, when you say, I don't want this, it's because you think it'll give you pain. You're predicting. So for any law, it's going to have an impact on people's imaginations. So how do you have an impact on people's imaginations? Well, it's more important for for punishment to be certain than for it to be severe. So it's more important that every time you talk in class, your teacher criticizes you, than for the one time the teacher catches you talking in the class, she hits your hand with the ruler. Because if you're certain that every time you talk, the teacher will punish you, then whenever you imagine the consequences to their actions, you'll always imagine the punishment. It'll always feature in your imagination. So Bentham says that's a really important thing. Also, about seeking pleasure, people are often mistaken as to what will give them pleasure. So this is a complicated thing about seeking pleasure, because if a legislator relies on what people say they want, his legislative actions won't actually give them pleasure. They'll be mistaken. So a legislator has to figure out what would actually give people pleasure when forming laws. So this is a really tough statement here, because a legislator has a really hard task here. He has to figure out what happiness is, because it's not just as straightforward as people having what they want. And I don't think Bentham thinks as much about this as he should, as how complicated it would be for a legislator to figure out what actually gives them pleasure. You do see where he's coming from, though. So, like, a drug addict would always only want to be only want drugs, even though that's not obviously what's in their best interest, and that's not what would actually give them pleasure in the long term. So it does make sense to try to help drug addicts instead of allowing them to keep taking drugs. All right, so I think it's pretty clear so far. So how do you actually compare pains and pleasures? Well, you use the philosophic calculus, which is pretty great, right? It's a great word, philosophic. So when you try to compare pains and pleasures, you use philosophic calculus. So you characterize the pain or the pleasure by an individual's conception of the pain or pleasure's intensity, duration, certainty, remoteness, and the legislature's conception of its fecundity, purity, and extent. So intensity, how much it is, how much pain or pleasure you feel. Duration, how long it lasts. Certainty, obviously how certain it is, whether you certainly will experience pleasure or maybe experience pleasure. Remoteness, how close or far it is to you. So presumably this has to do whether it's affecting your friends, your family, or you directly. And fecundity, the chance a pain has of being followed by another pain. Purity, the chance has of a pain being followed by pleasure. So for instance, when you exercise. And lastly, extent, which is the number of people who will be affected by pain. So this is really impractical, obviously, for a legislator to carry this out for every law and every person. But Bentham says you should try your best. If you're a legislator, you should try to be doing this. Now, this confuses me a bit because extent would seem to matter already, the number of people, and certainty seems like it should be way more important than anything else. But Bentham says these are all just components in your math. And Bentham is actually a pretty, he believes in equality. He thinks everyone who can experience pain or pleasure should be considered in the philosophic calculus. So men, women, and animals are all considered in pain versus pleasure. So everyone understands the basic idea, right? All right. Great. So if we understand the basic idea, let's get some modifications. So there's a few practical modifications we have to make to this, which are diminishing marginal utility, the disappointment prevention principle, and the importance of each person. So first, diminishing marginal utility. People who have a lot of pleasure, each additional unit of pleasure matters less to them than to those with not so much. So for instance, if you're trying to measure it in dollars or whatever, if there's a poor guy on the street whose life is always terrible, a little bit of kindness will matter a lot more to him than to someone with a great life. So you have to be aware that it's way better for a poor guy to get a little bit of kindness than for a rich guy to get a little bit of kindness, assuming the poor guy is much more unhappy and has a worse life. Disappointment prevention principle. People value pain, avoiding pain more than gaining pleasure. So we need to focus on preventing bad things more than making good things, avoiding pain more than gaining pleasure. So Bentham's example is we should focus on reducing poverty over focusing on growing the economy. Reducing poverty avoids pain, which is more important than growing the economy, which increases pleasure. There's not really a formal term for the last one, but Bentham was well aware of the dangers of utilitarianism with regards to the tyranny of the majority. So he tries a variety of ways of preventing it, of preventing the tyranny of the majority, but basically came down saying not to do it. So let's illustrate what exactly the tyranny of the majority is with an example. So if there's a really horrific murder, so someone is killed in a really bad fashion, people are scared, they're afraid to leave their houses, it makes a lot of people's lives worse. So maybe from a utilitarian standpoint, you think it's better to punish an innocent man and make everyone feel safer than to just focus on trying to catch the criminal if that's impossible. So you're making a lot of people's lives a little bit better and making one guy's life a lot worse. According to philosophic calculus, that might be okay if you make a lot of people's lives a little bit better and it's only one guy whose life is made worse. Bentham's really bothered by this, and he doesn't have a great philosophical reason. He just says it's bad, and once you start down that road, you won't be able to stop. Like, he just says it's a really, really bad precedent. All right. So let's talk about some. Let's go on. I wish we could talk about applications because Bentham was a very practical man, and he had all these examples for how you would apply it in law, in punishment, including his panopticon, and the practicalities of administration. But unfortunately, because we don't have time for that, I've put a silly comic about ethics instead. So here we have lives saved by Batman. If that's B, then the lives saved by the people who killed Batman's parents is B minus 2. So they've, so to some extent, because he killed Batman's parents, he helped save all those people that Batman saved. This is the problem with accounting for future results in ethics. I think it's sort of a clever comic from a comic strip I like quite a bit called Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal. So let's go on to some modifications by John Stuart Mill. So his greatest modification is to save it from the idea that it's only for swine. So Mill is troubled by valuing all pleasures equally, because legislators would have to equally support horse racing and Shakespeare. So, and he comes up with this idea of a tiered system of pleasures, because he says that people who have experienced both intellectual and personal pleasures prefer intellectual pleasures. In his words, it's better to be unhappy Socrates than a happy idiot. So this isn't really a great argument, because I don't think it's true for everyone that they prefer intellectual pleasures over personal pleasures if they've experienced both. And it's especially strange coming from John Stuart Mill, who was made so miserable by his dad making him pursue intellectual pleasures over personal pleasures. But the idea behind it makes sense. He doesn't like that legislators would put just as much money into horse racing as they would into people appreciating Shakespeare. However, this is not a great argument, and what's even worse is his proof for utilitarianism. So I'm not going to go into either of them more. I've mentioned a bit of his proof for utilitarianism in his homework, in your homework, and you can look them up in full if you want. His proof for utilitarianism is actually, it's pretty much a classic thing for philosophers to tear it apart. And it's also a classic piece of homework for you to tear apart the proof for utilitarianism. So poor John Stuart Mill, part of his fame is that people really, really love showing that he's stupid. All right. So, summary of philosophy. The way to determine the best action is what produces the most pleasure and the least pain. All right. So, it is 9:58. So let's take a 5-minute break. Hello. Come back at 10:03, and we'll discuss things. So you can grab some water, use the restroom, grab some food. I'll step out for a second, and then I'll be back to answer any questions that you guys come up with before we go on the background to philosophy. And yes. All right. Good stuff. See you at 10:03. All right. I'm back, ready to answer any questions you guys have on anything we've covered before we start again in a couple minutes. So, if you have any questions, type them in the chat. So that's actually an interesting question. One of the reasons why the British have such a divide is actually started with, well, part of it is just the language divide. It's the divide in distance. It's harder to sail across the ocean or sail across the channel to Britain than it is to just travel from, say, Germany to France. But another big reason is actually the Newton-Leibniz controversy, where Newton comes up with calculus and doesn't publish it. Leibniz comes up with calculus independently, publishes it, and then Newton claims that Leibniz stole calculus. And this actually starts this huge battle between the English and the Germans and the rest of the continent. And it starts this big division. Newton was of course important in math and science. Leibniz was important in math, science, and philosophy, and those were all mixed at that time. So that's a big cause of divide. In terms of what their differences are on, I mean, it's sort of a lot. The Germans tend to like this more difficult, almost mystical sort of philosophy. It's much less clear-cut than the British, I'd say. So for instance, the Germans have this philosophy of aesthetics is like a really big topic in German philosophy, which is what is beautiful, what can we be considered beautiful. To me, it doesn't make any sense. Like, I think what's considered beautiful is really just a matter of personal taste, and I don't really see the point in arguing about it. But they have, a ton of prominent writers on it. So yeah, it's also the way it's written in Germany is so different. German philosophers are really really difficult to read, like intentionally so. They don't like writing this sort of very clear-cut, obvious arguments that the British do, because they don't really believe that's proper. Like, they think there should be this element of like softness and mysticism to philosophy. So Kant is one way of putting it. Yeah, Kant is actually pretty easy to read for a German philosopher, and he's difficult to read. Like the guys who we don't go over, like Heidegger or Hegel, are just really painful. Like, it's not. You can ask John, who reads them in the original German. Like, they're really painful to read. And I don't think their ideas need to be that as complicated as they are. But that's the way the Germans like to write. So yeah. English philosophers' original works. Earlier ones were in Latin, and later ones are in English. Guys like Bentham are writing only in English. German philosophy, normally the distinction that's made is actually between Platonic philosophy and Aristotelian. So Plato has his form, he's a little more mystical. Aristotle is more clear-cut, and he's trying to understand the world. So the traditional distinction that's made is that German philosophy is more like Plato's philosophy, and British philosophy is more like Aristotle's philosophy. So that's the normal distinction that's made. So how to solve that problem from my perspective? It's hard. I don't think it's I think you just have to modify utilitarianism to champion individual rights. I don't think you can have a clear, just utilitarian philosophy. Bentham and Mill don't have a great answer because they try to keep it within utilitarianism, and they end up just saying, like, we don't have a great answer, just don't do this. I don't think it's possible to explain it or to solve it just with utilitarianism. All right, but it's 10:07, so let's get back to it. All right, cool stuff. Everyone can see my screen. All right, nice. So, as we were just discussing, in terms of the background to Bentham's philosophy, you would think it's based on Kant, but it's not at all. There's this big separation between continental philosophy, which is mostly German, but also French, and English philosophy. So Bentham had probably heard of Kant's name, but it's unclear if he knew anything about Kant's philosophy. So we really can't assume that Kant had any influence on it. But we can see his thought in Locke, Hobbes, and Hutcheson. So let's go through these guys one by one. So Locke, 17th century English philosopher. It's this guy here. Looks a little bit like Dobby from Harry Potter. We'll talk about him later and how things should work. And he's famous for this theory of knowledge, which is almost completely contrary to that of Kant's. So Locke says, I'm glad you guys like that. That was my intelligent comment of the day. So Locke claims that all of us start off as tabula rasa, which is Latin for blank slates. And so you guys know what a slate is, like a blank chalkboard or a blank whiteboard. And our minds are filled by the world and the associations that we make. So, you know, Kant is saying we have all these intuitions, all these structures in our mind. Locke says, nope, we're blank. Our mind's filled by the world. So Bentham takes his idea of pain and pleasure from this and how human beings form an idea of their interests. So, you know, people form an idea of their interests, what they want, based on associations. This brings me pleasure, this brings me pain. This also leads to Bentham's educational theories, which help lead to how John Stuart Mill is raised as a attempted genius. So that's Locke's influence. Hobbes, who's this guy here, who was brought up in the chat. He's another 17th century English philosopher, and in short, he says man in nature lives a brutish life. He needs the government to curb his worst impulses. So he's a brute, he's nasty, he's a thug without government. So government needs to control mankind through a system of rewards and punishment. And through this, government can maximize pleasure. So the influence on Bentham's pretty obvious here. Man in nature is a brute, and the government needs to control him like an animal. And then Francis Hutcheson was David Hume's mentor, and the influence on Bentham is super obvious. So you should just look at this quote. I'll read it in the original and then translate it into simple English. In comparing the moral qualities of actions, the virtue is in proportion to the number of persons to whom the happiness shall extend. Here, the dignity or moral importance of persons may compensate numbers, and in equal numbers, the virtue is as the quantity of happiness or natural good, or that the virtue is in a compound ratio of the quantity of good and number of enjoyers. The same number, the moral evil or vice, says the degree of misery, number of sufferers. So that action is best, which procures the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers, and that worst, which in like manner occasions misery. So, in simple English, well, we should determine the worth of our actions based on how much it makes people happy and how many people it makes happy. The best actions make many people happy. The worst actions make many people unhappy. So it's pretty clear. It really is utilitarianism here. The best actions make a lot of people happy. The worst actions make a lot of people unhappy. So that's why I say Hutcheson is really the first utilitarian, even though we didn't start with him, because he really does say this directly. So what's important about Bentham then? People say everything before Bentham does. He's not super original, but he's very detailed. He's very meticulous. He's willing to apply his philosophy to a wide number of cases. So these are all important. And last of all, he comes at the right time. Because he's so detailed and meticulous, and because he's constantly teaching people, he founds a journal. That means that Bentham ends up being really the father of utilitarianism. And he's helped even more eventually by John Stuart Mill. So, background philosophy. Utilitarians' beliefs weren't just influenced, but they were actually preceded in a lot of cases by philosophers like Locke, Hobbes, and Hutcheson. So we've covered introduction, history, historical background, philosophy, philosophical background. So last off, let's cover how they argued. The utilitarianism started off as a series of 3 articles in Fraser's magazine in 1861. But it was compiled and condensed into book form in 1863. So the advantage of this over what we've been reading before is it's meant for a popular audience. Like, it's an educated audience, but it's not just meant for philosophers. So the book didn't just popularize utilitarianism, but it also actually introduces it as a term. So the reason why I've done this instead of Bentham is, first of all, because it's more famous than Bentham stuff. And second of all, it's well presented and easy to understand. So I think this might actually be a nice change for you guys. I think there's a lot of what I'll read, which you guys will be able to understand before I translate into simple English. So I think it'll be cool. And if you guys are looking for a philosophical work to read in English, this might be a good choice for you. So this section we'll be reading focuses on what utilitarianism is. So what is it? It's become a little famous by now, but it's quite misunderstood. So Mill complains that journalists say utilitarianism is utility over pleasure, or only on pleasure. And he says neither of these understandings are good. Those who know anything about the matter are aware that every writer, from Epicurus to Bentham, who maintained the theory of utility, meant by it not something to be contrasted with pleasure, but pleasure itself together with freedom from pain. And instead of opposing the useful to the agreeable or the ornamental, they have always declared that useful includes these among other things. Yet the common herd, including the herd of writers, not only in newspapers and magazines, but in intellectually ambitious books, are perpetually falling into this shallow mistake. Having caught up the word utilitarian, while knowing nothing whatever about it but its sound, they habitually express it by keeping out or neglecting pleasure in some of its forms, such as beauty, ornament, and amusement. So in simple English, he says, utility isn't the opposite of pleasure, but it is pleasure, along with being free from pain. And pleasure is multifaceted, and it really just means whatever makes you happy. So beauty, ornament, amusement, all of these are things that make you happy, so it's pleasure, which is the same as utility. And by the way, in terms of continental divide, the Germans, when this was written, would hate to see beauty just thrown in here as another form of pleasure. But the English don't have any problem with this. The English say, yeah, sure, that makes sense. But Kant, for instance, would hate that. Kant would absolutely hate to see someone say that. All right. So I think it's pretty clear so far. Utility is pleasure. So let's talk about how this applies to morality. The doctrine that the basis of morals is utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong in proportion as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things that are desirable as ends, and everything that is desirable at all is so either for the pleasure inherent in it or as means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. So, every action can be judged on how it promotes happiness and avoids pain. Pleasure, which is the same as happiness, and avoidance of pain are the only things that are desirable in and of themselves. So you can think about Kant here, right? Kant had a lot of thoughts about the ends and the means, and he said goodwill is good in and of itself. But Mill is saying, nope, pleasure and pain. Pleasure and freedom from pain are desirable in and of themselves. Everything else should just be treated as a means to that. And so here, you guys should recognize this guy. This is the founder of the Stoics. And so the Stoics also, they wouldn't agree with this. They wouldn't say that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends. So this is really a different form of morality than what we've seen before. So Mill, at this point, having set up his philosophy, he consciously departs from Bentham. So he says something different. He says some pleasures are of better quality than others, so we can't just count the amount of pleasure. How do we decide which are better quality? If those who are competently acquainted with both those pleasures place P1, so pleasure 1, so far above P2, pleasure 2, that they prefer it even when they know that a greater amount of discontent will come with it, wouldn't give it up in exchange for any quantity of P2 that they're capable of having. They're justified in ascribing to P1 superiority in quality that so greatly outweighs quantity as to make quantity comparatively negligible. So basically, we ask people who have tried a bunch of pleasures which they value the highest. So there's supposedly some pleasure so great that people will accept some pain for it. That's a higher quality pleasure. And so what's interesting about the way he's arguing here is this like pseudo-mathematical talk. So P1, P2, we have these variables. So that's the idea. It really is supposed to be scientific. It's supposed to be mathematic. That's why he's talking like this. In terms of commentary, the reason why I put this guy here, this guy getting drunk sometime early in the morning, is you do sort of have to wonder, like, what would happen if Mill asked like this guy about this? You know, this guy is willing, getting a hangover, you know, what happens after you're drunk? Your head hurts, your mouth is dry. Like, that's not fun. But, you know, an alcoholic, a guy like this, is willing to undergo a hangover to drink. So in Mill's example, like an alcoholic, even in a particularly well-read one, would still prefer alcohol over anything else, even if he has to accept some pain for it. Mill doesn't seem to think about that, because Mill is, of course, thinking of himself here, not other people. So I think that's a big problem I have with this, is that Mill isn't really considering who's competently acquainted. He just assumes that he's competently acquainted. So what are these pleasures in Mill's eyes? Well, no big surprise. They're what he was trying to prove. Now, it's unquestionable fact that the way of life that employs the higher faculties strongly preferred to the way of life that caters only to the lower ones, people who are equally acquainted with both, equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both. Few human creatures would agree to be changed into any of the lower animals, turn for a promise of fullest allowance of animal pleasures. So he says anyone who has been educated and cultured would rather be unhappy and educated than happy and uneducated. So to me, when I see this, I think of, you know, poor young Mill. He's 20 years old. He's suicidal because his dad has forced him to be so cultured. And I wonder if he'd be quite so keen to be cultured if he remembered what it was like when he was 20. But, you know, all right. So, by the way, so brief pause. How are you guys finding this? Are people able to understand what Mill is saying before I translate it into simple English? Yeah, nice. That's great. Is anyone not able to? Is anyone having trouble understanding what Mill is saying before I translate it into simple English? No? All right. You don't get like the last sentence? Okay, yeah, cool. So Mill is saying about the last here, few people would want to agree to be changed into any of the lower animals. So very few people would rather be a dog or a cat or whatever in return for the fullest allowance of animal pleasures. So he says very few people would rather be a happy dog than an unhappy person. So yeah, all right, let's keep going. I'm glad that some of you are able to understand this directly. If you are, you should probably think about reading this yourself, because it's a nice introduction to philosophy, which is one of the reasons it's commonly assigned. But for everyone else, don't worry, I'll keep translating it into simple English. So Mill responds to those who say we should emulate the martyrs who suffered and led good lives. So Mill here is saying, is talking back to people who said we should act like martyrs. And martyrs are, of course, people who like die for their religion, like saints are often martyrs. So it often happens that a hero or martyr forgoes it for the sake of something that he values more than in its individual happiness. But what is this something if it isn't the happiness of others or something required for their happiness? It is noble to be capable of resigning entirely one's own share of happiness or the chances of it. But no one engages in self-sacrifices just so as to engage in self-sacrifice. It must have some end or purpose. You may say the end he aims at in his self-sacrifice is not anyone's happiness. It is virtue, which is better than happiness. In response to this, I ask, would the sacrifice be made if the hero or martyr didn't think it would spare others from having to make similar sacrifices? So, Mill says, yes, some heroes, some martyrs, they sacrifice things, um, they sacrifice their happiness for something else. And he says, but they do sacrifice it for something else. It's not just for no reason. Even if you say they don't sacrifice it for anyone's happiness, Mill says, well, they at least sacrifice so other people don't have to sacrifice. So Mill, in my opinion, Mill again here has this problem where he assumes his audience is like him. He says makes sense to him. This is why makes sense to why people sacrifice to him. But there are people who believe in the nobility of suffering. There are these guys in India who purposely give up everything and go live in a cave, and they're not trying to save others from making similar sacrifices. Like, they're doing it because they like sacrificing. So this is always a problem. By the way, Mill argues is he thinks everyone's like him. All right. So Mill responds to those who say utilitarianism encourages people to do bad things for the greater good because it'd be more expedient. Does the martyr also sacrifice for his own happiness because he feels happy for virtue? So that's an interesting point you bring up, Denise. So you might say here that it's really the martyr's, it's virtue. Virtue makes the martyr happy, so he's using happiness as a means for virtue. I think that it does make sense, but the danger of that is you end up with this style of argument that, you know, Popper would hate. Because anything you say, you can explain in terms of utilitarianism. So even if the martyr says, oh no, this is not for happiness, you know, you say, well, virtue would really make you happy. So you twist the definition of happiness to always be the reason for whatever people do. So I do understand the argument, but you have to be careful that you're not just twisting the definition of happiness to always make it the reason for actions. All right, cool. So back to this. So, well, why do we not do things for the greater good? Because it'd be more expedient that way. It'd be easier to do things for the greater good. Be quicker, less trouble. For example, telling a lie would often be expedient for escaping some temporary difficulty or getting something that would be immediately useful to ourselves or others. But first, the principal support of all present social well-being is people's abilities to trust one another's assertions. The lack of that trust does more than anything else to keep back civilization, virtue, everything on which human happiness on the largest scale depends. Therefore, second, the development in ourselves of a sensitive feeling about truthfulness is one of the most useful things that our conduct can encourage. The weakening of that feeling is one of the most harmful. Finally, third, any deviation from truth, even an unintentional one, does something towards weakening the trustworthiness of human assertion. For these reasons, we feel that fourth, to obtain an immediate advantage by violating such an overwhelmingly expedient rule is not expedient, and that someone who acts in this way does his bit towards depriving mankind of the good and inflicting on them the harm, involved in the greater or less reliance that they can place in each other's word, thus acting as though you were one of mankind's worst enemies. So he's trying to say that lying is not better than not lying. So he says lying isn't better from a utilitarian standpoint than telling the truth. And he has four thoughts about this. First, lying harms civilization. Civilization is based on people trusting one another. If people don't trust one another, then civilization is harmed. Second, people have to be discouraged from lying. So when we lie, we're encouraging other people to lie. Doing that is bad. Third, lying harms the idea of telling the truth. Generally speaking, we think that people tell the truth when they say something. Lying hurts that idea. Fourth, in conclusion, lying is not for the greater good. In fact, it's really, really bad. So this is surprisingly similar to an argument that Kant would make. And it's strange because Mill at this point still probably hasn't read Kant. There's still a divide. However, it would make much more sense with Kant and his universal laws. So it makes more sense to say, like, a world in which everyone lies all the time. If you're saying everyone should lie all the time, you'd hurt civilization. You'd you'd encourage other people to lie. So that's essentially your universal law. And then third, it's actually nonsense, because a world in which everyone lies is a world in which lies have no meaning. So it makes a lot of sense from Kant's point of view, which is strange because Mill's argument is actually a little weak. He makes a good argument for why you shouldn't always lie. Someone who always lies is going to obviously hurt other people's trust. They're going to encourage other people to lie. They're going to make people wonder if people have lied to them in the past. So that makes sense why you shouldn't always lie. But for us as like normal human beings, every once in a while we lie. Every once in a while other people lie. And it's like, okay, if no one knows you're lying, then you're not going to hurt other people's, you're not going to hurt civilization. You're not going to encourage other people to lie. And you're not going to hurt the trustworthiness of human assertion. You won't harm the idea of truth. So this is sort of problematic. Mill doesn't have a great reason for why we shouldn't just lie and not get caught. All right. So for our last thing, for both this class and for utilitarianism, is Mill responds to those who say utilitarianism doesn't work because we can't predict the consequences of our actions. Again, defenders of utility often find themselves challenged to reply to such objections as this. Before acting, one doesn't have time to calculate and weigh the effects on the general happiness of any line of conduct. This is just like saying, before acting, one doesn't have time on each occasion to read through the Old and New Testaments, so it's impossible for us to guide our conduct by Christianity. The answer to the objection is that there has been plenty of time, namely this whole past duration of the human species. So Mill says, it's silly to say that we don't have time to weigh the consequences of our actions, so utilitarianism doesn't make sense. Mill says, isn't this the same thing as saying Christians don't have time to read through the whole Bible before determining the moral actions? We use our past experience and the experience of others to determine what we think the consequence of our actions will be. So, in terms of commentary on this, again, I don't think this is a great example. Like, I don't think it's a great argument on the case of Mill, because it's way more reasonable to know the whole Bible, to read the whole Old and New Testament, than to know the future consequences of our actions. And so a Christian might respond, actually, yeah, you should know the whole Old and New Testament before you claim to act like a Christian. You do need to know all of the Bible. I think the idea is sound. And an ethical system relies on imperfect knowledge. You have to perform induction based on experience, but that doesn't mean we should just give up. So I think a better analogy for me is how Christians, when they do their ethics, they can't know all the possible consequences either. So, you might try to be a good Christian and give a charity some money, but then find out that the founders of the charity use the money for bad purposes. Really, they steal it and they go to bars and they buy very expensive alcohol and they claim that we're going to be helping orphans. That doesn't mean you shouldn't give to that charity, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't have gave to that charity. You acted like a Christian. You tried to help the poor. You tried to help the needy. It just turns out that you had the bad luck of giving to a bad charity. So I think for me, that would have been a much better argument to say all ethics are based on imperfect knowledge. Instead, Mill goes for somewhat mistaken analogy. All right. So, end of our outline. The utilitarians argued in a common sense, occasionally sloppy way. Especially Mill could be a little sloppy. He was much more focused on persuading people than proving. So this is supposed to be persuasive. He's supposed to be popularizing it. He's writing for a popular audience. He doesn't care so much about rigorous proofs like Kant or like, well, other philosophers in how to think. All right. So let's summarize. Let's conclude. So utilitarianism is not a very original philosophy. The ideas come up before, and even the main part of it is pre-stated by Francis Hutcheson. But it is a very influential philosophy. And in the case of Bentham, it's well argued and applied to an incredible number of circumstances, which makes it very useful for anyone who needs a philosophical basis. And in a world which seemed increasingly mechanical, the 19th century, we've got steamships and telegraphs and railroads. Counting units of pleasure and pain was an intelligent way to determine the course of action, determine what you should do. So this is why still today, economists will commonly use utilitarianism when they determine the effects of policy. And if you take an economics class, they'll often make you do calculations with utilitarianism. So, but things change. In the 20th century, the world becomes complex and it becomes very messed up. The scientific ideals of utilitarianism, therefore, they seem naive. They seem misguided. Could never believe that it was possible to divide the world into units of pleasure and pain in such a complex world. So we need a new ethical philosophy. We need one that accepts and embraces how complex and how messed up modern life can get. And this philosophy is existentialism, which we'll cover next class with John. All right. So, ended a little bit early today, but that is the end of, sitting in the dark. One sec. All right. Turn the light back on. So that's the end of utilitarianism. Prisoner's Dilemma doesn't have a ton to do with utilitarianism. It's more of a privilege dilemma is a game theory thing. It's not an ethical question. Thank you for the flowers. Always appreciate it. All right. Any questions? Questions about homework? So yeah, utilitarianism, maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain, or maximizing the avoidance of pain. Yeah. Yeah. So we have the whole list. We have Bentham's entire philosophic calculus for happiness and pleasure. You know, we have potency and fecundity and all those, and then Mill adds to that quality of happiness. Seems childish. Um, it's not quite sure why it seems childish to you. Who will I vote in the election and why? Normally I wouldn't say, but I don't really have a problem telling you guys because this is sort of extraordinary election. I'm voting for Hillary Clinton because Donald Trump is just a horrible human being. I don't like Hillary Clinton that much, but I couldn't possibly. I think Donald Trump is an incredibly dangerous and disgusting human being. He's not crazy. He's just not. He's just a really bad person. It's sort of astonishing how successful he's been, not by like hiding the fact that he's a bad person, but by advertising it. Like the first time he really became popular in this election was when he said that Mexicans coming over the border were rapists. Like it's really disgusting. So yeah, that's my political thoughts. So I don't. So that's the utilitarians are often accused of saying they'll do anything to achieve their goal, regardless of means. That's a very common accusation. That's not really true though, because the utilitarians, although they didn't know this, would have agreed with Kant that people should be considered as ends rather than means. So when you're like trying to encourage pleasure and avoid pain, you should really think if what I'm doing will definitely cause pain and maybe cause pleasure, like, you know, both Bentham and Mill would have said, don't do it. So the utilitarians really don't believe in like the ends justify the means sort of thing because they're actually much more concerned about immediate consequences of your actions. So the tyranny of the majority is more like well, it's like a classic problem in a democracy. So for instance, if you have well, in a country which is like 60%, well, let's do like an extreme example. Let's say 99% people who have blue eyes and 1% people who have brown eyes. So both But from a utilitarian perspective and from a democratic perspective, it's a really hard question to say, why can't we just say the blue-eyed people should be able to take money from the brown-eyed people? Because that might actually cause a net increase in happiness. So the blue-eyed people get happier, the brown-eyed people get less happy. But there are more blue-eyed people, so it outweighs it. Same thing with democracy. They could vote. The blue-eyed people could vote, and they would win every time, because there's 99 of them, and there's only one brown-eyed person. So that's the tyranny of the majority, is how do we prevent a situation in which these 99 blue-eyed people can do basically whatever they want to the one brown-eyed person? Does that make sense? All right, cool. Good questions. Good questions. Yeah. So I think that the issue with why utilitarianism is twisted is really because it has this bad reputation of like the ends justify the means, like you're just trying to do whatever you can to accomplish your goals. I think there is really a case to use it. And I think like whenever you're determining some sort of legislation, it actually can be quite useful. So like if you think about it, if for instance, like if you say people can't, so where I'm from originally is a bit out in the country, and so people would often burn their trash. So instead of paying to take their trash to like a big landfill, they would take their trash out in the yard and burn it. So there are laws against that. And so the question is, how can we justify those laws? It costs money for people to take their trash to the landfill. It's free to burn your trash. And so our justification here would be there's some amount of pain caused by burning trash, which is namely that it's very harmful to breathe in that smoke, harmful to you, harmful to your neighbors. So the justification is, yes, it causes a little bit of pain to people who now have to pay to get rid of their trash, but it's avoiding a lot more pain of the people who would get sick from burning trash. So I think that's the use of utilitarianism. It allows you to weigh a complicated law and figure out what would really be the best case here. So defining happiness is tough. One way that economists try to do it is they try to do it based on income or based on percentage of income. So for instance, to quantify it, they might say people will pay, well, let's say like there's, you can either take the bridge, which is quick but costs you $2, or you can take the long way. And that's going to be free, but it's going to take you like another hour. So economists will say you can figure out exactly how much pleasure that shortcut gives people based on how much they're willing to pay for it. So if people are willing to pay, say, $5 but not $6, then on average, that shortcut is $5 worth of happiness. On the other hand, if you charge $100 to go over the bridge and no one pays it, you can say, well, that shortcut's definitely not worth $100. So that's the way economists commonly do it. It's not a perfect system, but it's the easiest way of doing it. And then you do get into the problem of how to define it for individual people. So it's much easier to define it for people as a whole and look what their actions are like as a whole and see what they're willing to give up in order to get certain things. Good question. All right. So if half the country's happiness against the other half, like Syria, I would say the way that Bentham would come down on it is he'd say the avoidance of pain is much more important than encouraging seeking pleasure. So I think for him, he'd probably be against the uprising. You'd have to assume that whatever would be the necessity to like stop the fighting would be much more important than anything else like freedom of government or anything like that. So yeah, but it gets hard to it gets quite hard to measure stuff like that. All right, let's do well one or two last questions, and then I'll see you guys on Saturday. Before that, I know some of you have midterm exams, but you should still be doing your homework, engaging with the material, maybe even reading John Stuart Mill directly. So in terms of utilitarianism, pros and cons, I would say the biggest con that a lot of people think about is like it does seem shallow, and a lot of people dislike that. They think it's shallow, it treats people like animals, it doesn't accept higher purpose to life. The pros, I think it's not very hard to understand it. I don't think it's hard to justify it. There's only like a couple assumptions you need to make. And I think it's also seems much more practical. Like in your life, you can really think about what seems like a good action, what seems like a bad action, much more easily based on the utilitarians than you can on the Stoics or on Kant. I think it's much easier to apply. All right. So it is 11. So that's all for now. I'll see you guys on Saturday. Do your homework. Yeah. All right. Bye bye. 再见.